Siberia's taiga can make a crowded world feel empty. Nights arrive in a single breath. The tree line swallows the last light, and the cold slips in like a confession you didn't mean to tell. Along one modest strip of track lies a place so small even locals hesitate to call it a village. Kazynet, just a few homes, a utility shed, handrails that stitch the forest to faraway cities most residents will never see. On August 14, 1989, at 1:40 a.m., a long freight, 70 cars, steel and momentum, should have passed like a brief thunder, noticed and then forgotten. Two brothers were at the controls, veterans of the line who knew every bend the way a fisherman knows his river. Vadim and Igor Supranenko did what railway people do at that hour, watch the horizon for what should not be there. The horn pressed once, twice. The emergency brake hauled against physics. But trains don't negotiate, they commit. What followed was not the squeal of wheels or a shower of sparks, though there were those too, but a sound the brothers would later struggle to describe, the way language fails when tragedy runs ahead of meaning. When the locomotive finally sighed to a halt, the brothers stepped into a darkness that stared back. Lanterns in hand, they traced the rails as if following a thread back to reason. They expected a moose, a fallen branch, the soft sabotage of drifted debris. What they found instead was an arrangement that did not fit the forest. Bodies laid across the track, 7 youths, still, silent, final. There was no chance of sign-of-life checks or desperate compressions. This was past the point of help and already in the territory of questions. Kazynet, roused by sirens and the sudden invention of floodlights, gathered at the boundary between seeing and refusing to see. Workers, policemen, neighbors who shared bread and tools in daylight now formed a human cordon in the dark. The names arrived soon after, one by one, not as accusations but as endings. Boys from Mezhdurechensk, all 15, friends who hiked together, played soccer, and had set out that weekend to gather cedar cones that could be traded for pocket money. Their backpacks, curiously, were eventually discovered some 250 meters from the scene, lined up with a neatness that felt ritual to some, staged to others. The first official story drafted itself in the way official stories sometimes do, quickly, comfortably, and without much curiosity. The boys must have missed a late train, the reasoning went. Exhausted, cold, they lay down on the rails and fell asleep in a dangerous, unthinkable lapse. In a nation already murmuring with bigger news, Soviet structures creaking, a map about to be redrawn, this interpretation had the clean simplicity bureaucracy prefers. But even beside the track that night, where grief outpaced weather, a different feeling took root. This did not look like an accident. It looked arranged. Back at Mezhdurechensk, families heard the narrative and pushed back with more than sorrow. The boys did not drink. Toxicology would later confirm it. They were bush-savvy kids used to darkness, to trains, to the kind of common sense Siberia requires. Sleeping on rails was not a mistake they would make together. A freight horn and a stadium of steel approaching would wake anyone not bound to silence by something else. The Supranenko brothers would quietly add their observation. The bodies looked placed, not dropped, not scattered, laid. Yet the case closed quickly. Tragic accident. Documents stamped, files shelved, a ritual of closure without the substance of resolution. And as summer edged toward autumn, the taiga began its slow work of erasing traces, rain taking what rain always takes, snow sanding down the edges of memory until everything is smooth enough to forget. Except some things don't smooth. They stay sharp, they prod, they haunt. Grief can learn procedure. For 2 years, the families of the 7 moved through hallways and offices like penitent pilgrims in a secular church, petitioning officials who had already decided what they were willing to know. Doors closed. Phones went unanswered. Notes disappeared. The parents were told, politely then less politely, to accept the story and go home. But loss, when it refuses to be domesticated, becomes a force. In 1991, that force redirected itself to an address that might care, the office of President Boris Yeltsin. The letter they sent was not poetry. It was pressure. Concise, pleading, edged with the dignity of people who had buried their children and were unwilling to bury the truth. The timing was absurd. The state itself was in surgery, sutures barely holding. And yet, in a moment that reads like a hinge in a thriller, the letter found purchase. On October 8, 1991, the Prosecutor General's office reopened the case. Two names entered the story like new oxygen: Vladimir Guzhenkov, investigator for especially important cases, and Yuri Stolyarov, criminal prosecutor. Men from Moscow. Not rumor, not village. Process. By the time they reached Kazynet, seasons had scoured the scene. But negligence had done worse damage. Evidence, what little there had been mishandled or ignored. Guzhenkov did what investigators do in places that pretend not to see. He knocked on doors until doors became interviews. He asked again and again, until repetition itself became a lever. He found not ignorance but a wall of silence, a social geometry where everyone is cousin to everyone else, and shared roofs come with shared limits on what can be said. A name pierced that wall: Vasily, a local serving time for killing his brother Slava. Maybe just another story of vodka and violence, except the timing and the locale were too familiar. Rumor said Slava had known what happened on the tracks and had been sloppy with secrets. In a prison interview room over multiple visits, with patience rather than threat, Guzhenkov tugged at the knot. The first statements were mud, shifting, evasive. Then a shape emerged. Vasily implicated himself. Then, unwilling to carry the weight alone, he tugged more faces into the frame. His other brother Yuri, later the deceased Slava, eventually a name that made the story tilt toward madness: Nikolai, a senior police lieutenant who had been in Kazynet that weekend. Here the narrative resisted coherence. Could 2 or 3 gaunt men have subdued 7 athletic 15-year-olds without the forest hearing a thing, without one boy outrunning the scene? Without bruises of panic, footprints of flight, the math failed, and so did the motive. What could weld men together into a collective act of such brutality? As conflicting testimonies multiplied, Guzhenkov realized he needed something not subject to the elasticity of memory. He needed anatomy. He asked the families for permission to exhume the boys. The request tore at wounds not yet scarred. Still, they agreed, choosing pain with answers over pain without them. Under fluorescent light, forensic experts examined the bones as if reading a book left open too long. Skull fractures consistent across all 7, jaws broken bilaterally, forceful, deliberate, repeated, trauma to the chest and abdomen that spoke the grammar of blunt objects. The train hadn't killed them. The train had performed a cover-up the killers required. To test the shapes of violence, investigators swung railway tools against biomannequins, matching injury to instrument. It was ugly work, but precise. The physics lined up, so did the testimony of the engineers. In the headlamps, the bodies weren't chaotic, they were ordered, arranged, a staging, not a stumble. With that, the word murder entered the file not as speculation but as conclusion. The official accident had been an official error. When contradictions failed to collapse the new logic, Vasily altered his story again. He said Slava, already dead, had delivered the fatal blows. Convenient. Dead men shrug well under blame. But when pressed, Vasily slipped and coughed up a different kind of truth. The night had included drinking, a foreman from the track crew, and that visiting police lieutenant whose authority was both shield and weapon. Witnesses remembered liters of homemade spirits. They remembered men who considered boredom a problem requiring force. Then came the most fragile kind of witness, someone who had been part of the circle and could still speak. Under the kind of questioning that is less about volume and more about endurance, the foreman broke. He described the room, the bottles, the switch from talk to threat, and then the dread choreography on the tracks. Confrontation, the handgun's butt as gavel, and the order to leave no witnesses. The boys who tried to run were stopped by the simplest command a loaded weapon can deliver. The rest were beaten where they stood. Afterward, the men carried their crime to the rails, aligned the bodies with a mortician's care, and lined up the backpacks down the line to sell a lie to passers-by, and they hoped to the state. Truth had entered the story. Justice, however, would not be so punctual. The case reached court in 1995, and as in many trials where the community is the crime scene, the courtroom became a second town square. Parents sat shoulder to shoulder with reporters. Locals leaned against walls with the posture of people hearing what they already knew. For more than 7 months, The proceedings churned through testimony and technicalities, through the bruised night and the cold morning after. When the verdict finally arrived, it was spoken with the authority people think they want from law. Capital punishment for Nikolai, the lieutenant, the foreman and brothers Vasily and Yuri. For a minute, the families permitted themselves to believe in a country that could, at least sometimes, tell right from wrong. Then the country changed its mind. Russia, pivoting toward the Council of Europe and its human rights standards, stepped away from executions. Files moved. Petitions gained strange traction. On May 31, 1996, the first deputy chairman of the Supreme Court filed a protest that reshuffled the logic of culpability. The Supreme Court agreed. The sentences were overturned. The case returned to a state that sounded procedural, but felt like a trapdoor: reinvestigation. The men, convicted, named, set on a path toward finality, were released. Law is supposed to be a net that catches and holds. Here it served as a trawler that released its catch back into the same water. What followed felt less like epilogue and more like infection. Vasily attacked a cousin who, according to whispers, knew enough to threaten the new balance. Yuri died, suffocation, some said, pneumonia, said others. A railroad worker, one of the key witnesses who had helped remove the boys from the tracks, died beneath a train in Kazynet, as if the rails themselves demanded symmetry. None of these incidents were officially braided into the original case. But in towns like Kazynet, narrative doesn't depend on documents. It depends on the tilt of a head when a name is spoken, on the way whispers gather like frost at windows' edges. By the late 1990s, attention drifted elsewhere. Russia was busy with other emergencies, corruption widening like a crack in winter glass, war shaping headlines, transitions stuttering. The families, however, did not recede. In February 1997, they forced the case back open, this time under the legal phrasing, circumstances not fully investigated. That phrase, clinical and thin, became a passage through which something vast could move. 4 years of renewed work, 3 additional exhumations, 5 expert forensic reviews, over 100 witnesses. Files were hauled out, dust shaken loose. Old statements were read with new eyes. The name that would not stop returning was Nikolai, the lieutenant who, after release, had even managed to style himself into a municipal deputy. It is one of Power's tricks, to swap disgrace for office as if bureaucracy were bleach. Some investigations end with a single revelation, a key in the right lock. This one ended by accumulation, weight building until the system could no longer pretend it didn't feel it. In the fall of 2001, the Supreme Court of the Republic of Khakassia delivered a new verdict. Nikolai, the foreman, and Vasily were again found guilty. The sentences, however, arrived like dull stones rather than sharp blades. 10 years for the lieutenant and the foreman, 7 for Vasily. To parents who had spent a decade turning rage into stamina, it was not victory. It was a tired compromise that confirmed the crime while commuting the consequences. And yet, in the rickety machinery of justice, even tired cogs can move something forward. The official record, for all its hesitations, now held the truth the families had sworn to carry. The 7 had been murdered before the train arrived. The scene had been staged. Power had been used not to protect, but to predate. Sometimes a system works only because people shove it from the outside until it creaks into motion. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a fascinating case study that truly shows how persistence can uncover the truth even when things look impossible. Imagine a puzzle where the pieces are scattered, and some are even designed to mislead you. That's what happened here. At first glance, a scene might suggest one thing, like an accident, but dedicated investigators refused to accept the easy answer. They looked beyond the surface, noticing details like specific injury patterns that couldn't be random, and how objects were deliberately arranged to tell a false story. It's incredible how, despite efforts to obscure the truth, forensic science and meticulous detective work can bring clarity. It shows us that even when communities are challenged by fear or complex social dynamics, there are always those who champion justice. This case really highlights the power of determination, from grieving families who never gave up to investigators who pieced together the real narrative. It reminds us that every detail matters, and with enough commitment, the truth always finds a way to emerge, offering answers even in the darkest shadows. Thanks for watching, and if you found this insightful, please hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It is tempting when a verdict arrives to lower the curtain. In documentary time, a gavel reads like a final sentence, but real time does not settle so easily. In Mezhdurechensk, parents who kept calendars not to mark birthdays but to mark delays learned a different practice of endurance. They became archivists of their own loss, collectors of every article, every stamp, every small concession from offices that had first dismissed them. Their persistence rewrote a state's story about their sons. If that is not justice, it is at least a victory heavy enough to matter. Kazynet did not empty after 1989. Trains kept threading the trees. Seasons continued their old work. But the village would never again be merely a dot on the map. It became a word with a weight, shorthand for a failure to protect and for the capacity of ordinary people to resist that failure with unreasonable, admirable stubbornness. The rails remain. So do the ideas the case keeps pressing into any investigator who studies it. Ask again. Accept nothing easy. Read the geometry of a scene as if it were drawn by someone with reasons to lie. And remember that the simplest explanation sometimes survives only because those with power prefer it. There is a smaller lesson too, not about states, but about nights. In some lives, horror arrives as an event. Beating, staging, train. In other lives, horror arrives as a silence that follows, files closed, appeals filed, hands washed. The parents of the 7 refused that second horror. They dragged the truth into the light and then held it there long enough that institutions had to stare. What remains is not closure. The world seldom gives that. But clarity. And in stories like this, clarity is a kind of memorial. Today, investigators still refer to the Kazynet 7 when they teach about contaminated scenes, about timelines that must be rebuilt from bone, about the dangers of authority unmoored from duty. Journalists cite it when they write about case reopenings that only happened because citizens would not agree to forget. And those who stand in courtrooms on behalf of the dead, parents, cousins, friends, repeat its central instruction. Tell the truth long enough, and the world may be forced at last to answer. Does that make the taiga kinder? No, but it makes the map clearer. Somewhere between the birch and the pine, between the horn and the holt, 7 boys went from travelers to victims. The country around them shifted like ice in spring, opening gaps that swallowed justice, and then finally returned parts of it. The rest is what stories carry, so that others do not have to. The rest is why this mystery still haunts investigators, not because we don't know what happened, but because we do and because knowing came so late.